or the week after, recapping all the questions that were asked and the answers to those questions. So we're going to cover today are these 7 different areas. We're going to talk about how community development pertains to and applies to banks by their size: small banks, intermediate small banks, and large banks. Then we're going to talk about what is community development. We're going to try to help you know and understand how community development is defined under the Community Reinvestment Act. Then we will talk about the $64 million question, which is, what is satisfactory performance as far as community development is concerned under the Community Reinvestment Act? From that point, we'll launch into some discussion about what's called a community needs assessment. And following that, we're going to talk about how to properly document your community development activities so they can withstand examiner scrutiny. Then we will move on to number 6, will be the priority rule, which is a rule that most people are not aware of and which costs banks dearly in terms of community development. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you can get the edge in terms of community development under CRA, because little things can indeed be important and can make a critical difference. So let's begin by talking about how community development pertains to banks by their size. As all of you know, under the Community Reinvestment Act, there are 3 different layers of banks by size. There's the so-called small banks, who today now basically are defined as banks that are under $265 million in asset size. There's the intermediate small banks, though that's the new class of bank that was basically developed in 2005 when CRA was last revised. And those banks fall in the $265 million to $1,061 million size. And the large banks, of course, are the banks that are over the $1,061 million threshold. Now, with respect to small banks, there are no community development requirements under the regulation. But before any of you who are working for small banks quickly sign off of this webinar, I want to caution you that if you're a bank that is growing rapidly and you're in the $180 to $200 million range, and there's a likelihood in the next couple of years you are going to attain ISB status, you must be aware of something that is really, really important. And that is that when you become an intermediate small bank, you are immediately subject to the intermediate small bank examination standards. There is no lag period like there is from when you go from an intermediate small bank to a large bank, where they give you a 1-year lag. So if as of December 31st, 2007, you became an ISB, or as of the end of December 31st, 2008, you become an ISB, on January 1st, you will be, if any examination that's conducted on January 1st or thereafter, you will be subject to the intermediate small bank CRA standards. And they are radically different from small bank standards when it comes to community development. Because when you become an intermediate small bank, community development activity becomes absolutely critical to attain a composite performance evaluation of satisfactory or better. Unlike community banks, small community banks, where there is nothing in terms of community development responsibility, you now go from nothing to absolutely all-important status. So for ISBs, community development is one of the most important things of your CRA exam. And for banks who have been small banks and become an ISB, it's like culture shock. Because up until that point, since you didn't have any community development responsibilities, it's very, very likely that you didn't do anything community development-wise, or if you did so, it was by accident. But I can tell you right now that if you become an ISB on January 1st of next year and you're examined on January 2nd, you will be examined unequivocally under the ISB standards, and you will be expected to have done community development activity to pass your exam. In fact, only a week ago, I was in Chicago sitting next to the top CRA officer for the FFIEC, and I asked her, well, if a community bank becomes an ISB on January 2nd and they haven't done anything with respect to community development, won't that be a factor that's taken into consideration that they didn't have any responsibilities up until that point in time? and wouldn't examiners during an exam say, well, we'll give you a break this time because you were a small bank and you didn't have any responsibilities last year or the year before? And she looked at me and she said, absolutely no way. You basically know when you become an ISB that you're subject to community development standards, and you had better anticipate it while you're a small bank because we are not going to cut you any slack. And that's exactly what she said to me. So those of you who are small banks that are headed in the direction of being intermediate small banks, you had better be prepared for it. And those of you who are ISBs, this webinar is really critical for you in terms of surviving your CRA exam. For large banks, community development's always been there too, but ironically, for large banks, the importance of community development activity is not as critical as it is for ISBs. And that is because large banks are subject to a 24-point test in terms of their CRA performance evaluation. 12 of those points pertain to lending. 6 of those points pertain to investment, and 6 pertain to service. And all you need to do to attain a composite performance evaluation of satisfactory or better is basically to get 11 points. That means that you can, if you have very strong lending performance, you can attain a satisfactory performance rating on your entire CRA exam, even if you get 0 on the investment test and 0 on the service test. Unlike an ISB that doesn't have that luxury. So ironically, in 2005, when the regulators passed this new version of CRA and they sold it to the banks as a regulatory relief for banks in the $250 million to $1 billion size category, they really actually imposed tougher standards on ISBs and less forgiving standards on ISBs. So there's the old saying, or the regulation about truth in lending. I always say there ought to be truth in regulating, because I believe that many banks were misled by the regulators with respect to this topic, and ISBs actually have a more difficult situation with respect to passing their CRA exam than do large banks. Now, to give you an idea, by the way, when we conducted a study of 500 FDIC reporting lenders who were in that ISB size category as of 2005, and of the 500 lenders that we reviewed, 496 got a satisfactory performance evaluation or better. 4 got either needs to improve or substantial noncompliance. And of those 496 banks that basically survived their CRA exam, we took a look at how they were evaluated in terms of community development and community development investments in particular. And we found that basically 9 of those banks received substantial noncompliance on community development investments, and 82 of them, constituting 16%, received needs to improve on their community development investment activity. And the real shocker is that number in the middle. This number right here. 255, more than half, 51% of those banks who did receive a composite performance evaluation of satisfactory got low satisfactory on the community development investment test. What that means is that they were very marginal and they still survived their exam. If those banks were examined under the ISB standards, they might not get a composite performance evaluation of satisfactory or better, and they might have failed it. And it tells us that basically more than 60% of the banks, almost 70% of the banks that were in this study, basically were on the margin as far as CRA performance evaluations are concerned if they were evaluated as an ISB at the time. Now, having explained to you how critical community development is, particularly for banks that are ISBs, let's talk about what is community development. As I began this webinar, I mentioned to you how Potter Stewart didn't know how to define pornography. Well, community development itself can be complicated to define, and what we're going to do is we're going to attack community development and try to give you an in-depth explanation of what community development is exactly as it's defined under the Community Reinvestment Act.